He had everything: wisdom that made kings bow, wealth that turned distant queens into pilgrims, peace that stretched across every border. He spoke with God face to face, not once, but twice. He built a house so sacred that heaven itself descended into it, so heavy with glory that grown men could not stand. And yet Solomon died searching, not for answers, not for more gold or another throne. He was searching for meaning, the one thing all his wisdom couldn't deliver. How does that happen? How does the wisest man in the history of the world become the loneliest man before he dies? How does someone who built the temple where God's presence dwelled end up building altars to demons on the hills outside Jerusalem? Today we're going to walk through the untold story of Solomon's final days. Not the sanitized version you heard in Sunday school. The raw, unfiltered truth hidden in Scripture. The drift that started with diplomacy, the fall that began with compromise, the altars he never should have built, and the silence of God that followed his divided heart. But here's what makes this story urgent for us today. Before Solomon took his final breath, he wrote something, a confession, a warning wrapped in poetry. And if you're chasing success right now, managing compromise in the shadows, or slowly drifting from the God who once felt so close, his last words might be the turning point you didn't know you desperately needed. Because this isn't just about Solomon's fall. It's about how every heart blessed by God can slowly lose its way, how prosperity can become a prison, how wisdom without obedience turns into decorated emptiness, and how one final sentence, written in the twilight of a broken king's life, could bring you back before it's too late. What you're about to hear may change how you see wisdom forever. Solomon was young when he inherited the throne. Too young, he thought. His father David, the giant slayer, the warrior king, the man after God's own heart, had left shoes no son could fill. And Solomon knew it. The weight of the crown pressed heavier than gold. Israel had enemies on every border. The people expected strength. The elders expected wisdom. And Solomon? He felt like a child standing in his father's armor, drowning in expectations he couldn't meet. So he went to Gibeon, not with armies or advisors, but with 1,000 burnt offerings, smoke rising like prayers into a sky that seemed too vast to hear him. He came trembling, humble, painfully aware of how small he was beneath the weight of a crown meant for someone stronger. That night, God appeared to him in a dream. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Imagine that moment, the creator of the universe standing before a young king, offering him a blank check, anything. Power to crush his enemies, wealth beyond measure, a long life stretching into legend, fame that would outlive empires. But Solomon didn't ask for any of that. He said, "I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 5-9. The heavens must have rejoiced, because in that moment Solomon understood something most men never do. That true strength isn't found in what you possess, but in knowing you need someone greater than yourself. And God answered, not just with wisdom, but with everything Solomon didn't ask for. Riches no king had ever known. Honor that would make nations tremble. A name that would echo through millennia. But here's the truth we miss. The greatest wisdom isn't in knowing everything. It's in knowing you need God. Solomon understood that once. In the dark at Gibeon, humbled and honest, he got it right. But the gift that made him great would later become the very thing that exposed him. Because wisdom without continued surrender becomes the pride that destroys. It didn't take long for that wisdom to be tested. Two women stood before the throne, both claiming the same child, both insisting they were the mother. No witnesses, no evidence, no proof. Just two voices, each as desperate as the other, and a baby too young to speak for himself. The court fell silent. Every eye turned to the young king. This was impossible. How do you judge a case where truth has no fingerprints, where emotion runs just as high on both sides, where justice seems to have no foothold? The elders waited. The advisors watched. The people held their breath. Solomon sat still for a moment. Then he spoke. "Bring me a sword." The room froze. "Cut the living child in two," he said, his voice calm, unwavering, terrifyingly steady. "Give half to one and half to the other." One woman nodded, her face hard, her grief twisted into bitterness. "Neither of us will have him then. Let him be divided." But the other woman screamed, her voice raw, breaking, desperate. "No, please, my lord, give her the baby. Just don't kill him. Let him live." Solomon lifted his hand. "Give the living baby to the woman who pleaded for his life. She is his mother." The courtroom erupted, not in confusion, in awe, because they had just witnessed something beyond cleverness. This wasn't legal strategy or psychological manipulation. This was divine discernment flowing through a man who had surrendered himself completely to God. 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 28 says, "All Israel held the king in awe because they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice." The wisdom of God, not Solomon's intellect, not his training or his cunning. God himself, speaking through a yielded heart, revealing truth where human reason had no path. But every test reveals both the strength of a man and the seed of his weakness. And Solomon's weakness wouldn't come from an enemy outside the palace walls. It would come from within. Solomon had one dream greater than his own throne: to build a house for God. His father David had wanted to do it, planned it, gathered the materials, spent years collecting cedar and gold and precious stones. But God told him no. A warrior's hands, stained with the blood of battle, could not raise the temple. That honor would belong to his son, the son of peace. So Solomon built it. 7 years of labor, the finest cedar from Lebanon, hauled across mountains, gold overlaying every surface until the walls blazed like captured sunlight, carved cherubim stretching their wings across the Holy of Holies, their faces turned toward the mercy seat. Stones cut so precisely in the quarries that they fit together in absolute silence. No hammer, no chisel disturbing the sacred work as the temple rose. And when it was finished, the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant into the innermost chamber, the same Ark that had led Israel through the wilderness, the same presence that had shaken mountains at Sinai and parted seas before Moses, the mercy seat where God had promised to meet his people. Solomon stood before the gathered nation and prayed, his voice steady, his heart open, his hands lifted toward heaven. "Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way." 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 23. And then it happened. The glory of God descended, not gently, not quietly, not as a whisper or a breeze. It came like a cloud, thick and overwhelming, filling every corner of the temple with a weight so holy that the priests could not stand. They collapsed under it, trembling, undone, weeping, because heaven had touched earth, and no man could remain upright in the presence of perfect holiness. This was Israel's highest moment, the pinnacle of their faith. the generation that saw God move from tabernacle to temple, from wandering to dwelling, from promise to fulfillment. The people wept, the priests worshipped, and Solomon must have felt in that moment that nothing could ever go wrong again. But here's what we forget. Even glory can fade when gratitude disappears. The man who built a house for God would one day build altars for his enemies. The world had never seen anything like it. Gold poured into Jerusalem like water, 666 talents a year, a number that would later haunt the pages of prophecy. But in Solomon's day, it was just abundance, unimaginable, relentless, almost obscene abundance. Ships arrived from distant shores carrying ivory, apes, peacocks, things Israel had never dreamed of. Traders brought spices that filled the streets with fragrance. Merchants came with silk and jewelry, and woods carved by foreign hands. The throne itself was a work of art, carved from ivory and overlaid with pure gold, 6 steps leading up to it, lions standing guard on every level, their eyes seeming to watch everyone who approached. Everything Solomon touched turned to gold, literally. And then she came, the Queen of Sheba. She had heard the rumors carried by traders across deserts and seas. A king whose wisdom surpassed legend. A kingdom where justice flowed like a river and peace settled like morning dew. Where even the servants moved with dignity and the poorest citizen lived without fear. So she traveled with camels loaded with spices, gold and precious stones, simply to see if the stories were true. They were. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 6 to 7. The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. She stood in his courts and watched. The order, the beauty, the reverence woven into the fabric of daily life. She saw servants moving with purpose, heard wisdom falling from his lips like rain, felt the presence of something sacred in every stone and song. She listened to his answers and realized her questions were too small. She watched his kingdom function and understood hers was broken. She left breathless, changed, convinced she had witnessed something divine, and she was right for a moment. But here's the tragedy we miss in the middle of all that gold. The kingdom glittered. But the king's heart had already begun to dull. Because abundance without obedience doesn't stay a blessing for long. It becomes a weight, a distraction, and eventually a prison disguised as a palace. Solomon was a politician as much as he was a king. And in his world, peace required more than wisdom. It required alliances, treaties signed in blood and ink, marriages that sealed borders and silenced enemies before they could rise. So he married the daughter of Pharaoh, a political masterstroke. Egypt, the ancient enemy, now bound by family ties. Then came a woman from Moab, another from Sidon, one from Ammon, one after another, each union a strategic move, each wedding a diplomatic victory, each alliance another guarantee of peace. It made sense. It worked. The borders stayed quiet. The wars never came. And surely, Solomon thought, a man with the wisdom of God could manage it. He wasn't some weak-willed fool who would let women turn his heart. He was Solomon, the wisest man alive. But God had already spoken about this. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17. The king must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Not might be led astray, not could be, under certain conditions. Will be. It wasn't a suggestion left open for interpretation. It was a warning carved into the law long before Solomon was born, written by Moses, breathed by God himself. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the rationalizations, Solomon knew it. But wisdom, when it turns inward and stops listening to God, has a dangerous way of rewriting obedience into permission. "I can handle this," he must have told himself in the quiet moments. "I'm not like other men. My heart is established. I know the difference between alliance and compromise. I can honor their cultures without adopting their gods. I can love these women without losing myself." But compromise doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It doesn't march through the front gate waving a banner. It slips in quietly, wearing the face of reason, dressed in the language of wisdom. The palace began to change, slowly, subtly. Incense from foreign altars drifted through the courtyards, just small offerings, nothing major, gestures of respect for his wife's traditions. Statues that should never have been allowed past the gates were given places of honor, tucked into corners at first. Small ones, explained away as diplomatic courtesy. Every treaty demanded silence about something sacred. Every marriage required tolerance of something God had forbidden. And Solomon, the man who once prayed for discernment, began to confuse tolerance with understanding, compromise with compassion. The drift had begun, not with a fall, not with open rebellion, just with one compromise, and then another, until the space between his heart and God's voice grew wider than he realized. And then came the altars. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4-8. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. Not fully devoted, not completely gone, not worshipping demons in the dark, just divided. He didn't abandon God. He didn't tear down the temple or stop the sacrifices. He simply made room for others, created space for gods who had no right to breathe Jerusalem's air. Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, worship steeped in sensuality, temple prostitution, rituals that degraded everything God called sacred about intimacy and covenant. Chemosh, the god of Moab, an idol of power and national pride, demanding loyalty that belonged to Yahweh alone. And Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, a bronze statue with outstretched arms, heated from below until those arms glowed red-hot. Parents would lay their infants there as offerings, drums pounding to drown out the screams, priests chanting while children burned. Solomon built high places for them, not in secret, not hidden in caves or behind closed doors. On the hills east of Jerusalem, in full view of the temple he had built for God. Stone altars rising into the sky like monuments to betrayal. The same hands that once lifted the Ark of the Covenant, trembling, reverent, holy, now raised stones for demons. Let that settle for a moment. The man who once made heaven descend into the temple was now giving hell a seat at the table. The people watched. And what the king allowed, the nation embraced. What he tolerated, they normalized. The altars on the hills became gathering places. The songs once sung to Yahweh alone were now mingled with chants to gods whose worship demanded shame and blood. Mothers who once taught their children about the Exodus now whispered prayers to Ashtoreth. Fathers who once feared the Lord now burned incense to Chemosh for success in business. And through it all, the temple still stood. Its gold still gleamed in the sun. The priests still offered sacrifices. The rituals continued. But God, who had once filled that house with glory so thick men could not stand, was now silent. The voice that spoke at Gibeon, quiet. The presence that descended at the dedication, withdrawn. Solomon wore the crown. But heaven had left the building. God had appeared to Solomon twice. Twice. That alone should tell you something. In all of Scripture, there are only a handful of people God spoke to more than once in visible, undeniable form. Moses at the burning bush and on Sinai, Abraham under the oaks and on the mountain, and Solomon once at Gibeon and once after the temple was complete. The first time at Gibeon, God came with grace, with blessing, with a gift that would define a generation and echo through history. But the second time was different. 1 Kings chapter 9, verse 6 to 7. God's voice, no longer warm with affection, no longer inviting and generous, but if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I have given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. It wasn't a threat meant to manipulate. It was a forecast, a merciful warning wrapped in the language of grief, like a father watching his son walk toward a cliff, calling out one more time before the edge. God was giving him a chance. One final opportunity to turn back, to remember who he was, to choose obedience before the consequences became irreversible. But Solomon didn't turn. He heard the words. He must have felt the weight of them pressing on his chest. Maybe he even promised himself he would change, made quiet resolutions in the middle of sleepless nights. But his heart had grown too comfortable in the compromise, too entangled in the alliances, too assured in his own ability to manage what God had already forbidden. Wisdom had become his idol, and idols always promise control while they slowly steal your soul. And so the voice that once called him beloved fell silent. Not because God abandoned him. God never abandons his people first. But because Solomon had stopped listening. The noise of 1,000 voices, wives, advisors, foreign priests, political pressures, had drowned out the one voice that mattered. Even divine warnings lose their sound when the heart closes its ears. The crown was still on his head. The kingdom still obeyed his decrees. The tributes still poured in. But heaven had withdrawn its favor. And the man who once walked in the counsel of God now walked alone, surrounded by people but isolated in spirit, powerful but empty. Judgment came, but not the way Solomon expected. It didn't come through war. No army stormed the gates. It didn't come through plague or famine or some dramatic cosmic sign. It came through a prophet, a piece of cloth, and a man Solomon thought he could trust. Ahijah the Shilonite met a young man named Jeroboam on the road outside Jerusalem. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's officials, capable, strong, loyal, ambitious. A man with leadership written into his bones. He had served the king well, managed projects, earned respect, and God had chosen him for something Solomon would never see coming. Ahijah was wearing a new cloak. Without a word of explanation, he took it off, gripped it with both hands, and tore it into 12 pieces. The sound of tearing fabric broke the silence. Then he handed 10 pieces to Jeroboam. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen, he will have one tribe." 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 29 to 31. The cloth tore the way the covenant had been torn, the way Solomon's heart had been divided between God and Ashtoreth, between obedience and compromise, between the wisdom of God and the wisdom of man. 10 tribes, gone, ripped away. But even in judgment, mercy lingered. One tribe would remain, Judah. Not for Solomon's sake, his choices had forfeited that privilege, but for David's sake. Because God had made a promise to David, a covenant sworn in heaven, and God does not break his word even when his people shatter theirs. The kingdom Solomon built with wisdom, wealth, and peace would not survive his son. It would split down the middle, bleed, war against itself for generations. Brother would fight brother. Altars to God would stand across the border from altars to Baal. And Solomon? He would live to see the prophecy spoken. He would hear about Ahijah's cloak and Jeroboam's call. He would know his legacy was crumbling before his eyes. But he would die before it unfolded. The question is, did he change? Or did he just wait, watching the kingdom hold together by a thread, knowing the tear was already written, the judgment already sealed? The palace was full, but Solomon was alone. The music still played every night. The banquet still overflowed with wine and delicacies from every corner of the known world. Gold still lined the walls, catching the light of 1,000 lamps. But somewhere in the hollow center of all that glory, the king sat, aging, weary, grey, surrounded by everything he ever wanted and none of what he needed. He had chased it all, pleasure in every form, knowledge from every source, achievement on every scale, power that bent nations to his will. He built gardens that rivaled Eden, terraced and lush with every tree that pleased the eye, planted vineyards that stretched beyond sight, their grapes pressed into wine that flowed like rivers, filled his courts with musicians whose songs made queens weep and poets envious. He constructed reservoirs and aqueducts, owned flocks and herds larger than small kingdoms, accumulated silver until it became as common as stones in Jerusalem. He denied himself nothing his eyes desired, refused his heart no pleasure it requested. And at the end of it all, he looked around, really looked, and felt nothing. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 2. Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Vanity of vanities, the Hebrew says. Vapor, smoke, a breath that disappears the moment you try to hold it. Not the cry of an atheist, not the despair of someone who never knew God. This was the confession of a king who had everything and discovered it was nothing without the one who gave it. He dissected life with the precision of a philosopher, analyzed every pursuit, every ambition, every fleeting joy with the mind God had given him. He wrote about rivers that run to the sea but never fill it, about generations that come and go and leave no lasting mark, about the wind that blows south and turns north and circles back again, endless and exhausted, going nowhere. He wrote about trust, but had forgotten how to live it. He wrote about fearing God, but had spent decades tolerating his enemies, building their altars, silencing his conscience with diplomatic necessity. And now, in the twilight of his reign, Solomon wasn't a king anymore. He was a preacher, not the kind who stood in the temple with authority and confidence, but the kind who sat in the ruins of his own choices, writing warnings for others, hoping someone would listen to what he learned too late. The shift was complete. From ruler to mourner, from the wisest man alive to the loneliest soul in the palace. So Solomon wrote. This time, a confession, raw, honest, stripped of all pretense, Ecclesiastes. It reads like a man walking back through his own life, opening every door, examining every choice, every moment he thought would satisfy, and finding them all empty, like someone holding up their life's work to the light and watching it dissolve into smoke. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 10 to 11. Read that again, slowly. This is the man who had it all, who built a kingdom that made the Queen of Sheba lose her breath and her composure, who possessed wisdom that drew nations to his feet like students to a master, who lived in luxury most people couldn't even imagine. His conclusion: I chased the wind. I spent my life grasping at air, pursuing shadows, building monuments to my own glory that couldn't fill the void inside my chest. Solomon finally understood what it took him decades to see. When life becomes about what you build instead of whom you serve, even success becomes slavery. The pleasure fades the moment you experience it. The applause dies before you leave the stage. The projects crumble, the achievements get forgotten, and you're left standing in a palace full of treasures that can't touch the ache in your soul. Ecclesiastes reads like despair, but listen closer. This is awakening. Solomon, at the end of his years, stripping away every distraction, every accomplishment, every compromise, and finally saying what he should have said all along. What he knew at Gibeon but forgot in the palace. Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, and then at the very end, Solomon wrote, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind." Fear God, keep his commandments. The king who once prayed for wisdom ends by pleading for something simpler: obedience. The man who knew everything finishes by saying the only thing that matters is surrender. Wisdom without obedience is just well-decorated emptiness. Knowledge without surrender is slavery dressed in royal robes. But his story wasn't over. Even in failure, even in the ruins of a divided heart, God was still writing something beyond Solomon's mistakes. Solomon's final days were quiet. No grand ceremony marked his passing, no dramatic exit with nations watching. Just an old king sitting in the shadow of all he had built, eyes clouded not by age alone, but by the weight of seeing too much and understanding it too late. He had seen everything a human being could see, the cloud of glory filling the temple until priests fell to their knees, unable to breathe in the presence of holiness. The Queen of Sheba bowing in wonder, her voice breaking as she confessed that not even half had been told. The altars on the hills where his wives burned incense to gods who demanded shame and blood. The faces of advisors who stopped challenging him. The silence of prophets who once spoke freely. He had walked with God and walked away from him. He had known the heights of divine favor and the crushing weight of divine silence. He had tasted every pleasure and found them all bitter in the end. And now, at the end, stripped of illusions, he understood. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 29. God created mankind upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. Many schemes. Diplomatic marriages that seemed so reasonable, strategic compromises that promised peace, temples for foreign gods disguised as gestures of cultural respect. Every clever plan that made sense at the time, and led him further from the one who had made him great. Solomon had pursued wisdom as if it were the destination, as if knowing more would somehow be enough. But wisdom was never meant to replace God. It was never meant to become an idol in itself. It was meant to lead him back, to keep him humble, to remind him every day that he needed someone greater than himself. And in his final breath of literary legacy, that's exactly what it did. His words became scripture, canonized, preserved, read by millions across millennia. His life wasn't perfect, his reign wasn't flawless, but his repentance was real. In the end, he stopped defending himself and started telling the truth. Solomon's kingdom split after his death. 10 tribes to the north under Jeroboam, 1 to the south, Judah barely holding on, surrounded by enemies, a shadow of what the United Kingdom had been. But that single tribe wasn't an accident. It wasn't a consolation prize or the scraps left over after judgment fell. It was mercy. God had made a covenant with David, a promise spoken under stars, sealed in heaven, that one of his descendants would sit on the throne forever, that his line would never end, that through his family God would accomplish something no human king could achieve. And even though Solomon failed, even though the kingdom shattered like pottery on stone, even though the temple he built would one day burn to ash and the glory would depart, God's promise didn't break. Because it was never really about Solomon. It was about the king who would come through his line centuries later, the one who wouldn't compromise, wouldn't drift, wouldn't build altars to false gods, or let his heart be divided between heaven and earth. Where Solomon failed, Christ fulfilled. Solomon built a temple of gold and cedar that decayed and fell. Jesus built a temple of human hearts that will never fade, never crumble, never be destroyed. Solomon received wisdom from God as a gift. Jesus is the wisdom of God, incarnate, perfect, unshakable, the Word made flesh. Solomon's glory blazed bright and faded in his lifetime, dimmed by compromise and idolatry. Christ's glory will never end, never dim, never be shared with another. And here's the question that matters for us now, today, in this moment. If wisdom itself could fall, if the man who had everything could lose his way, where is your heart anchored? Not in what you know, not in what you've built, not in how blessed you are or how much success you've achieved or how many people follow you, but in Him, in Christ, in the one who never drifts, never compromises, never divides his heart. And as we reflect on Solomon's end, there's another story that runs beside his, different in every way, but strangely the same. God gave Solomon the greatest mind the world had ever seen. He gave Samson strength no human being had ever carried. Both men fell, not because they lacked power, because they stopped guarding their hearts. If Solomon's story moved you, you need to see what happened to Samson. His fall is a mirror of this one, shows you how even the greatest gifts collapse when your heart drifts from God. Watch that video next. It's the other half of this warning.